everybody. This is May 18th, 2015. Welcome to the Spirit Gathering teleconference. This is Ken Frey. Our topic for this evening is spiritual aspects of bodywork and healing, and I'm very glad that you've all joined us for this evening. We are recording this call so that people who cannot be here this evening will be able to listen in the future. So please, if you haven't already done so, press your mute button or *6 to mute your telephone line, so that way the line is kept quiet from interferences. So let us all take a moment now to get settled, to center ourselves, and to let go of the events of the day and begin to enter into a deeper sacred space within ourselves. Let us imagine that we are joining together sacred heart to sacred heart with every other person on this call right now. Let us imagine that we are joining together in a circle with a light or a flame or fire in the center. Imagine a spoke of light coming from the circle to your heart, and for each person on the call tonight or listening in after, we are now connected sacred heart to sacred heart. And we'll connect our hearts to all. Let us set our intentions. We listen to one another with compassion and curiosity. We ask for what we need and offer what we can. We deepen our connection with one another and the divine. May this sharing serve us, our communities, planet, and all. And so it is. This discussion is scheduled to go for approximately an hour. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, even if you've made a comment earlier, if you could please state your name. I'm Ken Frey. I'm actually a reverend and healing counselor of the Church of Tzaddi since the mid-'80s. I was a student and used to teach actually with Frank Alper as part of the church, and I've been connected with the church ever since. My day job is I'm a physical therapist. I head the Institute of Physical Therapy in New York. I teach craniosacral therapy and visceral manipulation, basically osteopathic subjects, with the Burrell Institute and Upledger Institute, which is really the same institute with different names. So I've been on the faculty with them for some time, and so I teach basically all over the world. Always, when we're hearing teachings, we're treating, it's best that we kind of have the intention in our mind, so that may this, what we hear be beneficial for all, basically. So this short talk, hopefully will become a discussion. So I think maybe my comments serve as a facilitation or a catalyst for further discussion about the interrelationship between spirituality and physical healing. So, of course, we know that there's physical healing. We could break it down to physical healing, emotional healing, and then in some cases, of course, it's going to involve the spiritual dimension, or that these become apparent. So any of these three, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, can be combined, and actually various schools of thought have different methods diagnostically to determine which is more prominent, the physical, the emotional, or the spiritual. So as a practitioner, as a therapist or as a practitioner, if you're aware of the main sources of the person's conflict, it's a little bit easier to be able to focus in on that and address their needs. And many times, actually, it's in the process of treating that you actually discover that there's an emotional or underlying, let's say the physical, that there's an emotional or a spiritual involvement. I did a little in preparation for this talk, because my talk is usually on the physical aspects and emotional aspects, so it's kind of interesting. I put together a little bit of a list summarizing the categories that tend to come up in spiritual aspects of the healing. And some of those categories are as follows. And so what people bring up is, a lot of people, I'm sure this stir a commonality amongst us, they come to us and they're really trying to find or help find or connect to their spiritual path. Some of the other aspects come up is people have kind of spiritual aspects in relationship, parents to lineage to family. Other times it's related to, as we all know, past lives or karmic situations, lessons being learned over lifetimes. It could be relationships to non-physical phenomena. So this might include a person's relationship or awareness to other realities, other physical or non-physical dimensions, like non-physical energies, whether it's spirits or gods or, the full realm. Many times, I find a lot of times what people are coming up with, or there's a conflict about, or a lack of knowledge about, is death, and death more so, but it could be death or birth matters. And then you have the people who are under spiritual attack, possession, or curse. Sandy, who's form holding on this, healing counselor Sandy says, relating to the land and elements, and also Sandy says spiritual healing is an intention to relate on a spiritual level, not just physical or emotional, and I think that that's absolutely correct. So that's a little bit of a long list, and we can come back to it, but I want to kind of formulate this from the perspective of physical healing, because that's usually the way I'm approaching people, and maybe, I get to share a little bit about what's being shared with many other people about how a physical body holds restrictions and how we come to that, because I'm playing it from the physical to the emotional and the spiritual. So I wanted to lay a little bit of a foundation here with fundamental principles that we use or understandings in regard to physical healing. But it's not just physical healing, of course, it's emotional and spiritual healing also. So this is as follows, okay? Firstly, I guess it's not always realized that all manual therapies, all manual therapies are based on the understanding that there's an inherent movement within the body, that something's restricting normal, healthy motion, so that there's either a pathobiomechanical, what we say pathobiomechanical, or pathophysiological effect on the body. In other words, they're restricted, in simple terms, they're restricted someplace in the body in all manual therapists, whether they're physical therapists or massage therapists or chiropractors or you name it, osteopaths. We're all dealing with releasing the physical restriction. That's what we all do. A.T. Still, the father of osteopathy, he was in his prime in the 1860s. He trained Sutherland, who then developed cranial sacral therapy, Miller, who developed lymph drainage therapy. He trained for some time Palmer, who then developed chiropractic. He was the main source at the time. The teachings come to me from Sutherland was the holder of the teachings. Then that went to John Upledger, who was my mentor, who passed the teachings on. It was as cranial sacral therapy. Still, though, Andrew Tyler Still used to say that disease is a result of anatomical abnormalities, which was then followed by physiological discord. In other words, so our job was not so much, and he was a doctor, osteopath, who really studied a lot of naturalistic approaches to healing, and then that became osteopathy. And so he said that our job is not to treat the physiological discord as much as finding and treating the anatomical abnormality. So spiritual restrictions is, I would say, just another potential overlay that may be, into the situation. So manual therapists believe that they have the idea that movement is life, or that life is somehow reflected in movement, and that whether it's an organ or a structure, a physical structure in good health, will move in all physical planes of motion. And so the key to understanding the pathology is to understanding the mobility or the lack of mobility. Now, surrounding each structure in our body, every organ, your joints, everything, is connective tissue. And that connective tissue, which we also know as fascia, is connected to every other part of your body. So bone, tendon, ligaments, muscles, organs, our vasculature, our nerve supply, down to the most minute portions of the cell are all made up of connective tissue. So connective tissue is the substance, you could say, that unites our entire body, head to feet, cranium to sacrum, down to the toes. So due to this interconnectedness of the connective tissue or fascia, when we touch one part of the body, we could feel through it. You could get a reflection or a feedback, you could say, to any other part of the body. So one of the main mediums to the message is fascia, is really what we're using as a kind of what we're tapping into. So we have, you could say, we have what we call listening techniques. It means it's palpatory techniques. It's ways that we touch a body that we determine where the person's holding. Because if we don't know where to go in the person, then you're a little bit lost. Now, you could say, if you're a spiritual counselor, I guess, that you might have a different technique to go to where the person is restricted by some type of spiritual information, I guess, and I guess that that's perfectly valid. I don't exactly work that way, so I'm just explaining it from a physical perspective. From a physical perspective, there's different ways to do it, but there's something called general listening or local listening. In craniosacral therapy, we call it arcing. In myofascial release, we'll call it like fascial glide or kind of a fascial evaluation. But the listening techniques is the heart and soul of the work, because it allows us to be able to identify the main area of holding in the body. So, for instance, what we would do is, there's a lot of ways to do it. Somebody trained in visceral, the idea is that, let me make it simple. The idea is that since the body hugs a lesion, so if there's a restriction in somebody's body, you could say it's like a knot. And so because this connective tissue is connected throughout the body, if you tap into that connective tissue system and you have a little bit of an open mind and an open hand, in a sense, you could feel like a magnet where you're pulled inside that body. And then we break down the body so the person could learn kind of where to go inside the body, whether it's on the right side of the body, or the left side of the body, the upper or the lower, or anterior in the body or posterior in the body. So if you touch somebody on their head and you get pulled down to their ribs, maybe a little bit above the ribs, it's on the right side of the body, it's probably just above the ribs. It's probably their liver, because that's what's there. If it goes down a little bit further on the right or on the left, it might be their kidneys. If you get pulled straight down into their pelvis, it's the pelvis, and then we could determine by locally looking to see exactly which structure it is, because the better the specificity, you're kind of right on what you need to work on. Now, In craniosacral therapy, what they're using this ebb and flow. They're saying that there's this flow of craniosacral fluid, which is kind of interesting because it holds energy of physical, emotional, and spirit in a sense. So it's kind of an interesting medium. But you're listening to this craniosacral rhythm that's moving through the body, which is connective tissue, and they're basically doing the same thing from a palpation of craniosacral rhythm. That's what craniosacral therapy is using as their evaluation tool. And it's very accurate. It should lead you to the same spot no matter what technique you use. What was interesting was that Upledger said, so I found this comment in a book of Upledger where he kind of puts this together with energy and emotions and all, and I thought it would be interesting to hear. It's from a book on craniosacral therapy, what it is and how it works, on page 8. He says that gentle traction applied from different directions enables us to localize restricted areas in the body, which are interpreted to be current sites of active problems in the body or residue from previous problems in the body. So he goes on to say, the site of an active lesion or restriction in the body can be anywhere in the body, not just where the person complains of the symptom. Usually the active lesions or problems disrupts the gross physiological activities as well as the more subtle energy functions and patterns as seen with, he's referencing it, with acupuncture meridians. So when we're doing these listening techniques and all, it's always taking us to the area of greatest restriction in the person's body. You could say the part that's calling out as the most active lesion in their body, which doesn't mean to say that's necessarily the causative factor. It could be the result, but it tells you where in the body they're asking for help now. Because it's all day long I see people that they'll come in and they say their back hurts or they got a headache or they have whatever the problem may be. It goes on into a myriad of things, of course, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily where their restriction is or where you need to start. They know where they hurt. We all know where we hurt, but we don't always know where it's coming from, in a sense that you might have a low back pain, but it's actually caused by pulling your sacrum, and you just know that you hurt in your low back. Well, you've got a headache, and you're not going to know that that's coming from your thorax or that's coming from your pelvis. Well, that's coming because the sacrum's pulling into your head, and we could go on all night on discussion like that. So if we know where to go, that's really interesting. I think that's curious from the point of view of the spiritual implication, or certainly the emotional, which I'm going to talk about straight away. So it happens to be, if you touch somebody's head, they're standing on their feet, and we put our hand like in the center of the head, and we're listening then for where they draw us into the body. If the person falls backwards off their feet, you have to catch them. You can't let them fall, of course. That means it could technically be that they fall forwards or even sideways, but they fall off their feet because we say that the body hugs the lesion. And if you go off your body for, what is this now? If you go off your body 4 inches, it's, I have it in centimeters here, so I get confused sometimes. Hello? If you come off your body at 4 inches is 10 centimeters, is the physical body. If you go off your body on a physical field with your hand out to 30 centimeters, 12 inches, then you have like an emotional body. So if you want to read the physical body or the emotional body, you could do it through those fields. So if a person falls off their feet, it usually means that they're being pulled into an emotional field, meaning that there's an emotion. Usually the person falls backward. It's an emotion from the past that's pulling them backwards. It's saying it's an emotional problem. So you can get this variation of diagnostic to determine where to go in the person's body that's most actively holding the lesion. Now, of course, we also recognize that there's emotional blockages or imbalances that may be involved with these physical restrictions. And we know what these are because we're seeing them all the time with people. If they're angry, if they have resentments, if they have, it's a love issue, a trust issue, they're attached to something. There's a huge range, of course, of emotional, loss, all kinds of problems like this, which get combined in emotion. And I think a lot of times when we're even saying emotional problems, there's a thin line between it being emotional and it being spiritual when I think about it. So I thought it'd be interesting for the spiritual community, in a sense, to I wanted to share this kind of connection that we make to it from a physical level, because connective tissue, of course, has the capacity to hold memory. That's why a lot of times when we're treating somebody and we touch a certain place, they'll go into a certain memory. So it's kind of funny because it could be like a little bit like a tape recorder, I guess you could say, in that you go to touch, let's say, their low back, and it doesn't have to be the low back. It could be anywhere, and they'll go into a certain story. And you take your finger off their low back, and they change their flow of consciousness of what they're talking about. You go back to their low back, and they'll go back into that story because we're facilitating that memory when we're touching that part of the body. And in fact, Elmer Green, who was from the Mebinger Foundation, kind of coined the term an energy cyst, which means that there's concentrated areas where foreign or disruptive or obstructive energies get walled off within the body. So when we're touching a restriction, it might well be, of course, an emotional, and they didn't do the work on the spiritual level like this, but of course we know that a lot of times there's spiritual issues connected within this, and they called that kind of pocketing of energy an energy cyst. And so these energies, of course, of the unconscious impressions get imprinted on the cells in the nervous system. They believe it to be within the cerebral spinal fluid also, which is what, of course, we're doing by cleansing or working on it. And that's part of kind of craniosacral therapy. So the work is, so usually you find what's going on in somebody, and then in a little bit of an advanced kind of aspect to this, okay, the person could be lying on the table, and then we're treating the restricted area, and we could just treat the area. That's what happens many times. We're treating the restrictions, and they're very thankful. We're treating their blockages in their body. Many times, I don't really know what it's connected to tell you the truth. It's not like I have a clairvoyancy that I know that this is connected to that necessarily on every individual. However, we do have therapeutic, we have this whole avenue of what we call somato-emotional release, which basically means when you go into the emotional aspects, or they didn't name it for the spiritual, I think we're ahead of the curve. But nonetheless, it could, of course, involve spiritual dimensions also. So it's what we call therapeutic dialoguing and counseling. And I think that's a lot what we do as spiritually orientated practitioners. So it's really dialoguing in a skillful way. And I think that there becomes a thin line between talking about spiritual realities. So spiritual realities. I think when we say we're talking about spiritual realities, that there's like an absolute truth about things, and then there's like a relative truth like we have here. And we're talking about then like a skillful means or an artful approach to this. Because, we know their physical complaint. They may or may not know the emotional implication. And then you get into this other place that I think what happens a lot of time is a lot of people I see, they don't realize the spiritual implications of what is going on. It's like they didn't realize the spiritual dimension to things. And I think that we get into, in a sense, it's counseling at that point also. So, I think that we get, in our understanding here to a discussion, I think is really where I come to about the kind of things we get involved in. I don't know what your reaction is to what I'm saying, but I imagine we have different cases or things fall under the topics that I've mentioned at the beginning, where people go. And so maybe I'd like to hear from you a little bit about kind of what gets stirred in your mind from maybe what I've said already, any questions you might have. Let me kind of put it back to you all and kind of see where we go with this. Just say your name and also take the mute off your telephone so we know we could hear you.
Hi, Ken. This is Amy
Hi,
from
Amy.
California. Hey. So I'm loving what you're saying, and it's so interesting because you're putting your hands on people and you're starting from the manual physical contact and moving through the connective tissue, the fascia, into the cells and the cellular memory, and then into the emotional and into the spiritual. And I'm working with people completely by telephone, long distance, into the field first, and then it with like vibration and resonance, and then it moves into the body and into the organs and into the connective tissue with that kind of a touch. In other words, I'm doing a kind of a yogic touch of awareness from a distance healing way. And that moves into the physical. And it's just so interesting and so refreshing to hear such a grounded physical approach. And I'm just really appreciating what you're sharing.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I usually treat people who are in front of me, but occasionally that's not the circumstance and you have to do it distance-wise. And because we have all you on the telephone, I think this would be most interesting. It's been my experience, not knowing, but my kind of process. I have to hear your response because my approach to that is if I image the person who's asking for help, and if I image their body, and I don't have to know them, but I go through a body like I'm going through the head, like I put my hand like I'm going down through their body, except for I'm imaging their body, of course. So if I go through their head, if I go down through their neck, if I go down, of course, through their shoulders and the back, through their lumbar area, down their legs, or you could even do it from the front side, okay? So when I do that, I get pulled to the area where their restriction is. And what I've done in the distance is I've actually treated them like I'm treating them in front of me, but we have this methodology that from an energetic point of view, I could tell you so many stories, but from an energetic point of view, we do something called the direction of energy, where you're basically sending energy in. Well, you could use the person's energy. There's different ways to do it, but you're sending the energy into the area of the restriction, which has profound effect, of course. So you're lining it up, and then, of course, we're doing this energetic kind of interrelationship or overlay to that. So I'm just wondering, what's your process, if there is one, of determining where to direct the healing energy or how you do it? That's my question.
Are you asking me, Amy, or just generally to the group?
All the above.
Well, I have a really detailed intake process that I use. I have an enrollment form on my website, and I basically ask 3 questions, which is, what do you want to let go of? What do you want to create? And is there anything else you want to tell me? And then the first part of the session, I talk with them, and I I take that enrollment form and I pray over it and I meditate, and I'm connecting with them before the session happens in my meditation prayer space. And so if somebody sends in a form on a Monday, for all intents and purposes, the session starts on Monday, even if they're not scheduled till Friday or till a month from Monday. And in that time, I'm kind of doing what you say you do, which is finding their body. I'm also feeling into if they list family issues, marriage issues, whatever they talk about, I'm finding it as energy in that period, that gestation period before the session. So in that way, it's really different from having a physical plane practice where people walk through the door and then they present. I've worked that way also, but right now I'm just working all this distance way. And when I actually talk to them, usually stuff has already moved because of that preparation and that long-distance connection. And it's at a deeper level of presentation, a deeper lesion or lack of movement in your terms. It begins to reveal itself to them. It's often a healing crisis. And in that time, I become more present is the way I would use the words. It's about my sense of presence and connection with whatever it is that they're bringing, whatever burden or pain or sickness that they're bringing. And through that presence and through the spirit inside of me, that there is movement that happens. I was also very excited when you were talking about movement, because that's also my experience, is that any of these manifestations are like a pause button, like things get frozen, things get shut down, things get walled off, and the tension and the pressure builds in the system until something's got to give, and that's when they come for help. So I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but that's my answer to your question.
I find that fascinating. I'd love to also hear, thank you for sharing that, Amy. I'd love to hear from some other people what your kind of listening technique is, what I'm calling it, basically your mechanism to determine where to treat the person. That is, so yeah, that I think it'd be very interesting for us all to learn from each other on. You're not, whoever it is, I don't hear you coming through. Hello? So is anybody else like to share?
Ken?
Yes?
It's Ken.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
I'm good. So my question is, I am not a practitioner, so the only listening I do is on the phone. If somebody is on your table, is there a meditative practice they could use to help guide you where it is you want to go or where you need to go?
Actually, I don't think it makes a it really doesn't make a difference if they're meditating or they're not meditating. I think it's within the purvey, you could say, of the practitioner, the sense within themselves to be able to feel where the restriction is. So I think Amy's saying that she's doing from a spiritual counseling intervention. It's the same in physical, in that our training is to, just like we're doing in this process, we're letting go of any of the concerns of the day, any of the concerns that might be going on, let's say in your office or with other patients or with family or whatever is going on in your life. We're trained to let go so that you're kind of meditative. So when you talk to somebody or you're treating somebody, we don't have any expectations. We could just be with them, open-minded in a sense. I think there's a communication that we're able to pick up in our awareness, whether we're doing it from our hands or we're doing it from our ears or we're doing it from some combination like this, to feel what's going on with the person. And in fact, we even say, that I have a slide when I'm teaching is because, you have a lot of people, and I think the problem that happens in the medical system is that they're thinking first, and then they're treating based on what they're thinking. What we do is we feel first. So we feel what's going on in the person, and then I use my intellect to know that that's a friction it is. And then by being open, then I think what the emotional or the physical, the spiritual, or the issue is. I think that's for the patient, though. I think, of course, patients who somebody's line is open with their dog barking. Okay, so for the patient who's a practitioner who does some spiritual practice, I generally find that they move quicker or could go deeper than other people because I think they're riding this energy in their core. Like they've cleaned up a lot of extraneous energies, and I think they've got chi basically moving through them in a different way that, let's say, a conventional, you could say, person doesn't have. I think that if the person is settled within themselves, you could say I think that they could go deeper and certainly access maybe a much more deep-rooted, relationship, what their problem is. But, of course, sometimes it's emotional, and then it's right on the surface because the people know what their emotion is. So I don't know that you could say that, the state of the person is a criterion to be able to work on their problem at all. It's a long-winded answer, but that's my answer. How does that sound, Ken?
Hello? It certainly makes a lot of sense. As a patient, I wish that there were things I could do to help the process along. But it sounds like what you're saying is that, if I take care of my end of business, you'll be able to help me get farther down the road.
Yeah, I think it's easy for the patient. You just have to show up. I really think that's it. You have to show up, and I think the rest can happen. I think their intention is demonstrated by their being there. What I think, we have this thing that a lot of therapists say that, they've healed the patient. I don't actually believe it to be true. I think it's very healthy. I think we can be facilitative, heal. In other words, I could be on the right spot, and I could facilitate that process to happen, but I think the person's really doing the healing.
Okay.
Just the person's there, and they're lying there, and basically, I think they, have an intention. And I think that they've, I think that that's their criteria. Mute, sure your phones are muted. Because as we're touching somebody, as we're working with the person's really doing the healing process. I'm not healing them. They're healing themselves. They think they're healing them. But, of course, you could treat 5 different people, and you're going to get 3 or 5 different responses. Each of those individuals have a slightly different capacity of what they could do or where they could go.
Do you have a sense about why some people respond to different types of hands-on healing? Some people respond better to chiropractic, some to acupuncture, some to cranial sacral. Do you have a sense of why different people respond differently to different modalities?
That's a good question. If we looked at it, like if I broke it down like this, that I think some people respond, there might be certain body types and certain, let's say, touches that certain people are more drawn to for one reason or another. In other words, if somebody has a very tight body structure, then maybe they would do better with deep tissue massage, or they're really tight and it's very difficult to get through. Maybe deep tissue massage works better for them. Or maybe they like a firm touch. Now, you give somebody who has a very light, sensitive, energetic touch, like they're doing Reiki or they're doing like energy work, they're going to think you're from Mars because they can't relate to it. Whereas those people feel a deep massage, we could say, they can relate to it. Does it mean it's necessarily better for them? I'm not necessarily sure, but they may relate to it better because if they can't relate to it, what's the use, really? So I think that sometimes in energetic work, some people have no idea really what's going on, or they just can't relate to it because of either their body type or their sensitivities and so on and so forth. And some people come into me, most people come into me and they're totally in tune. But occasionally, very occasionally I might add, in fact, rarely, thank God, that the person will come in and they didn't really know what happened, basically. The only good fortune is, fortunately, most of the time they'll feel better afterwards, so they know something happened. But a lot of times, you're touching them in a rather sophisticated way, or you're treating them in a rather sophisticated way that they have no frame of reference to. And I think that's where the problem could come in. So I tend to explain things to them so that they have, they understand what I'm doing. If not, I'm touching them for a half an hour or an hour. They don't know what's going on. So if there's any follow-up on this from Ken or somebody else wants to, I want to respond to what your questions or needs are like this too. So I'd like to open this up for a discussion.
It's Amy again, Ken. When we open up for discussion, it takes a minute for people to unmute and get their thoughts organized. So don't feel that if it's quiet, nothing's happening. Just give it a little time.
Yeah, okay. So in the meantime, I'll just go over the list here. So what I find many times when we could talk about any of these, that a lot of people, I think, are coming to us and they're looking, they're attracted to us. And they're really looking, in part, they're lost. And they're looking to be connected to a path. A lot of times, of course, they're going to have different problems that they're going to go into in relationships to parents, lineage, or family. Of course, there's the issues of a lot of times what's been interesting to find is that people are dealing with past life issues or karmic issues. Of course, not everybody realizes that. We know that we're touching the person and they have a problem in their knee now, or in their back, or in their pelvis, or in their head, or their headache, or whatever it might be. Having worked with people who are fairly clairvoyant, it's interesting to learn that many of them go back to a past life episode that this dates to. In fact, I have my own story. I treated this person. This guy... It's a little bit of a strange story because the person had the patient had a kidney transplant. And the problem that sometimes happens with transplants is that the energy of the person that donated the organ is different from the person or the personality or the energy of the person who's the recipient of the transplanted structure. And so I had this guy who certifiably was a total nut, to tell you the truth. And so, of course, there was a conflict between the kidney that he got and him. So I'm doing this whole process between balancing these energies, basically, in this person. It's really, on a physical level, it's like I'm treating the kidney. On an energetic level, it's like you're clearing the energy in relationship to it. And you have to get into it through a therapeutic dialogue with the guy, and then you've got the dialogue with the energy of the soul, or you could say the energy from that donor, and you have to create a peace in this situation. Well, something happened, and I messed up in the deal. And afterwards, I was going out to lunch, and my knee went out. Well, knees are ruled, kidneys rule knees, so they say. And I had a torn meniscus. I straight out had a torn meniscus. I had a meniscal problem like 15, 12 years beforehand. I fixed it myself, but now I knew it was torn. I knew straight out. I got back to the office. When I got back to the office, I lied on the table. One of my therapists, I asked to help me, and they said, you got a torn meniscus. I said, yeah, I know I got a torn meniscus, you know. So the thing is, I wound up on the table with one of my colleagues, somebody I had trained, who is very clear energetically. She's done a lot of spiritual, energetic trainings also, besides physical trainings, of course. And so she worked on my knee. She worked on my knee for 3 months. After 2 or 3 months, I thought maybe I was thinking I might even need an operation myself. I'm on the table then one day, and it sounds like a crazy story, and unfortunately, this is going to be on tape, I guess, for other people to hear in the future. But nonetheless, it sounds a little, for us it sounds normal, for other people it probably sounds odd. But I got the impression when I'm on the table then, being worked on, that I'm on a spaceship and they were doing surgery on my knee. I'm having a surgery done on my knee in another space and time. I don't know when, but I know I was on a spaceship and they were doing surgery on my knee. Well, when I got done with that session, my knee was fine. Now, I could tell you many, many, many stories of patients of things like that, and I think a lot of times there is some form of hook. Of course, we know this to what happened for the person, who has some common problem that we're treating now, but we don't always know what that is. Anyway, there's many stories like this. So I also find a lot of people come in, and then there's all kinds of death issues involved, whether it was their previous death, there's fear about death. Death is a big issue. And then there's these other topics that I mentioned. So if anything like this comes to mind for people, then, we could enter into a further discussion about it.
Ken, hi, it's Kate.
Hi, Kate.
Hi. So this is, as a patient of yours and Sandy's, this is fascinating to listen to, so thank you for sharing all of this. Do you find that there are common experiences across your patients based on the issue that's presented? So you mentioned death issues. Do death issues show up in a common way across patients, or are they, do they tend to, those kinds of, emotional or spiritual issues tend to be unique to each person in terms of how they show up?
Yeah, if I had to really say, I would think that, it's more unique to the individual what might be going on to their circumstance than anything else. If I had to say, though, I think that in older people, I see a wide array of people. Some people are totally spiritually educated, and some people are totally uneducated. And I think in the uneducated, then a lot of times they don't know what happens at death. They have no frame of work to it. They might even, and then you have people who believe in past lives or don't believe in past lives. And I think that there's a kind of a demarcation between kind of understanding about reincarnation and death that kind of gives a deeper, broader spiritual insight for the individual. So I might say, you can't always say it's just older people, because I think younger people, they may not be educated in it, but it's not on their mind, basically. So I would have to say, though, it's more unique than, I don't know. Offhand, my first response is that it's more unique to each situation. Yes, hello?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I imagine a lot of you all have people come to them that are trying to find their spiritual path. I mean, or maybe everybody's already found their spiritual path, but by the time they find somebody of probably the level that we're dealing with in terms of spiritual intervention here, is that something that is commonly happening for you all?
It's Amy again, Ken. I can say that I think I tend to work with people who have found the spiritual path, yeah. But that it's weird, like these lesions or these places of not flow or not movement, it's like they bring us into our spiritual path more deeply. Like even if we found it, or we think we found it, then we find it more. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think if we get to truth, then of course you're going deeper into your understanding of yourself and maybe all that is. I think that's what happens, and it seems to be that I guess our karma catches up with us physically too, and so that's a route into understanding it.
This is Kate again. So, you bring up an interesting point, and I think that one of the things that I found is, the work I've been doing for the last 10 years with, is some of the work that Amy's been teaching, seems to generate physical healing crises. And I've been going through one for the last couple of years that, has been at times very challenging. And so the connection between sort of that physical, that spiritual growth, or maybe I'm not growing, maybe I'm shrinking spiritually, but I guess the connection between that spiritual searching and the sort of physical manifestation of that. I guess when I started this journey, consciously, I wasn't really expecting that, and but I think both Ken and I have found that a lot of this work that we're doing, there is obviously an emotional and physical connection, and it seems to stir stuff up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I think that it is basically a representation of our inner conflict to a degree, or some karmic residue, in many cases is what we're having in a physical manifestation. And so if we're doing spiritual work, it's like working the equation from the other side. Instead of you having had, a liver problem, let's say, and coming in, or a low back problem, it's sort of like you were working on the fact that somebody stabbed you, I'm making it up, in a former lifetime, and then it was in the low back, and so as you're releasing that energetic trauma, the physical comes up. So I think, of course, it could be facilitated from the spiritual work, forward, of course. So I think that's kind of like how the mechanism works.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. A lot of, what sometimes happens to me is that I get referrals from clairvoyant people. I don't know how. It's like your name gets out there somehow. And so it's kind of funny, but nonetheless. And they'll tell me what the problem is. Like they'll say, oh, it's the person's pituitary or something like this. And it may be true. What I frequently find is it may be the pituitary, but I had to do 5 or 10 other steps to get there, to clear it, to kind of allow it to be in an organized way. Like I just couldn't get to where they're going. So sometimes what the clairvoyant will say, it's totally right, but it's not, you can't just get to it like that physically. You have to go through certain layers. I kind of talk about a lot of times that when you're treating somebody, of course I'm teaching people the art of listening to the body and knowing where the restriction is and the order of the release. So the sequence sequencing or order of the release, physically you have to go about it one way, and it's like an archaeological dig. So sometimes you don't know really where you're going necessarily or what's underneath it until you kind of get to that layer. As opposed to spiritually, they already know what the layer is, you know what I mean? Now, which is most effective, I'm not really sure. You know what I mean? I know the way I go about it. I think it's different strokes for different folks, basically. I don't know if other people, if any comments you'd like to have, because we're going to have to, I'm advised that we're going to have to wrap this up at a certain time relatively quickly. So if you'd like to make some other comments, this would be a great opportunity to do it. So I'm not hearing anybody. So what I'd like to say is, there's a great book, by the way, on emotional implications on body. It's a book that Jean-Pierre Barrel wrote, who's probably if not the top osteopath that they might consider in the world, certainly one of them. And he wrote a book that he wrote for patients, but it's quite in-depth about the different emotions you find in different organs of the system. It's quite a comprehensive book that costs next to nothing, basically, to buy, which is Understanding Messages of Your Body. So I think you might like that one. He also has nutritional advice and the kinds of character types that you have from different problems that relate to different organs of your body, your pelvis, your, like uterus, bladder, your spleen, your liver, your heart, all like this. So I think it's quite an excellent book. He's the man who's behind the visceral manipulation, which is like an osteopathic approach. That would be a good book. John Upledger has some excellent books on somato-emotional release, which was the process of dialoguing with people when they went back into their histories of what was underlying the problem. And they're fairly readable, they're totally easily readable books by, everybody. So upon that note, I'd like to invite anybody, if you have any comments, to say what's on your heart or your mind. If not, I'd certainly like to thank you all for joining us in this Spirit Gathering teleconference. This call may be archived as an MP3 at www.tzaddi.org. Phone access to the recording of this call is available until next month's call. For playback of the recording, please dial 712-432-1085, access code 990322, and the number sign. That's access code 990322 and the number button. So we hope that you'll join us for the next Spirit Gathering, which is going to be next month on June 16th with Neva Rain. It's on the spiritual healing and cancer, her personal story, or a personal story. I imagine it's her personal story. These calls are hosted by Tzaddi, an interspiritual metaphysical organization founded in California in 1964. Tzaddi welcomes, nurtures, and supports people in celebrating and more directly experiencing their relationship with the loving presence of the divine. Our programs are open to people of any race, color, national, ethnic origin. Please visit www.tzaddi.org and learn more. We will now close with thanks and blessings. Thanks to the Tzaddi founders, Amy Keats and Dorothy Blackmere. We'd like to thank all of you who have been part of our community this evening and this discussion. We'd like to thank the Divine who supports us always, even when we're not aware of it. We tend to say, I say a blessing that comes from a Buddhist prayer. By this merit, may all beings obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may we free all beings. So I'm hoping that maybe what we've shared tonight serves to help others and I'm wishing you all a very good night.
Thank you so much, Ken and Sandra. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Okay, everybody. Thank you for joining.